The phone rang at 3:17 a.m. Margaret Wilcox opened her eyes to darkness, the same darkness that had enveloped her life for 43 years. Her hand found the receiver before the third ring, a reflex developed over decades of waiting. Outside her window, the Georgia pines stood silent against a moonless sky, their silhouettes a jagged edge against the infinite black. The ringing sliced through the quiet house like a knife. Margaret had slept lightly since 1978, her body never fully surrendering to rest, always maintaining a vigilance that had become as natural as breathing. The bedside lamp clicked on, casting a weak yellow glow that barely reached the corners of the room. Dust motes hung suspended in the light, as if time itself had paused. "Mrs. Wilcox?" The voice belonged to Sheriff Daniel Hayes, son of the man who had first knocked on her door that summer evening in 1978. There was something in his tone, a tension, an urgency that made her grip the receiver tighter. "We found her." 3 words, simple words, words she had imagined hearing for 15,739 days. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind thousands of times, imagined every variation of emotion that might wash over her, yet, now that it had arrived, she found herself speechless. The air in her bedroom suddenly felt too thick to breathe. The ticking of the hall clock seemed to grow louder, marking seconds that stretched like hours. "Mrs. Wilcox, are you there?" the voice continued, gentler now. In the background she could hear muffled voices, the crackle of a police radio. "Yes," she whispered, her free hand clutching the faded photograph on her nightstand, Eliza on her 20th birthday, laughing in the sunlight, unaware of how little time she had left. Margaret's fingers trembled against the glass frame. "Where?" "The old Whitman property." A pause, the sound of papers rustling. "Behind the greenhouse. And Mrs. Wilcox." Another pause, heavier this time. "We've made an arrest." Margaret felt a cold wave wash through her body, leaving her fingertips numb. Outside, an early morning mockingbird began to sing, oblivious to the shattering of Margaret's world for the second time in her life. "Who?" she managed to ask, though some deep part of her already suspected the answer. "Charles Whitman." The name hung in the air like smoke. Charles Whitman, Ashland's benefactor, the man who had held her hand at Eliza's memorial service, the man who had brought her soup when she caught pneumonia in the winter of '82, the man whose eyes had never quite met hers when he spoke of hoping for closure. The digital clock on her bedside table blinked. 3:19 a.m. The red numbers seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of their own. 2 minutes. In 2 minutes the foundation of her grief had shifted beneath her feet. What began on a warm July evening in 1978, when Eliza Wilcox walked 5 blocks to the Sinclair Library, was finally coming to an end. Ashland, Georgia, 1978. A town of 12,000 souls nestled between rolling hills and cotton fields, a place where church bells marked the hours, and the Coca-Cola billboard at the town entrance hadn't changed since 1965. Main Street ran straight as an arrow through the center, flanked by the courthouse with its white columns, Garrett's hardware store, the Sinclair Library, and the Crown Theatre, with its marquee promising air conditioning and weekly double features. The summer of '78 had been particularly hot, the kind of heat that seemed to rise from the asphalt in visible waves, that made dogs lie panting in the shade and elderly folks retreat indoors by noon. The smell of honeysuckle hung heavy in the evening air, mingling with the occasional tang of fertilizer from the surrounding farmlands. Cicadas sang from dawn till dusk, their rhythmic drone the soundtrack of southern summers since time immemorial. Brick storefronts with striped awnings lined Main Street, their windows displaying mannequins in polyester dresses, fishing tackle, wedding china, and penny candy in glass jars. The barber pole outside Floyd's turned endlessly, hypnotic red and white spirals, promising a trim and the latest town gossip for $5. At Donovan's Pharmacy, the soda fountain still served cherry cokes mixed by hand, the marble counter worn smooth by generations of elbows. Ashland was the kind of place where people rarely locked their doors, where neighbors brought casseroles when someone fell ill, and the high school football games were attended by nearly everyone, where everyone knew not just your name, but your parents' names, your grades in school, your first crush, and that embarrassing incident at the 4th of July picnic in 1973. The local radio station, WGEO, played gospel on Sunday mornings and country music the rest of the week, the DJ's voice familiar as family, announcing birth announcements and obituaries with the same warm cadence. The Sweet Magnolia Diner served the best peach cobbler in 3 counties, the recipe a closely guarded secret, passed down through 5 generations of the Wilson family. The diner's neon sign flickered after dark, casting a pink glow on the cracked sidewalk below, where initials and hearts had been etched into the concrete decades ago. On summer evenings, the elderly gathered on the courthouse benches to watch the sunset and reminisce about times gone by. Men in short-sleeved shirts with pens in the pocket, women with handkerchiefs to dab at perspiration. All of them witnesses to Ashland's slow evolution from the horse and buggy days to the age of Skylab and 8-track tapes. They spoke of the drought of '54, the big snow of '67, the time the governor's motorcade passed through town. Their memories were the unofficial archives of Ashland, stories passed down in porch swings and beauty parlors. The Whitman textile mill stood at the edge of town, its red brick smokestack visible from nearly everywhere in Ashland. 3 shifts a day, 5 days a week, the mill provided the economic backbone of the community. The whistle marked time as reliably as the courthouse clock, 7 a.m., noon, 3 p.m., 11 p.m., the rhythm of working life in a town that still made things with its hands. Eliza Wilcox was 22 that summer, with chestnut hair that caught the sunlight and a laugh that made strangers smile. She had a slight gap between her front teeth that she had once been self-conscious about, but had grown to accept as part of what made her unique. Her eyes were her mother's, deep brown with flecks of amber that seemed to catch fire when she was passionate about something, which was often. She walked with purpose, chin slightly raised, a young woman who knew her own mind. She had graduated from Ashland Community College with an associate's degree in business and worked as a teller at First Georgia Bank. The bank manager, Mr. Hiram Phillips, had already hinted at a promotion to loan officer assistant if she decided to stay in Ashland. "You've got a head for numbers, Eliza," he told her. "That's rare and valuable." But Eliza had nodded politely without commitment, her dreams focused elsewhere. Every morning she arrived at the bank 15 minutes early, her shoes polished, her blouse crisp, her name tag perfectly straight. Customers would sometimes choose her line, even when others were shorter, drawn by her efficient warmth and genuine interest in their lives. She remembered their children's names, asked about sick relatives, celebrated their small victories. She kept her tip money in a blue ceramic jar shaped like an owl, and saved every issue of Life magazine that featured space exploration. The Apollo missions had captivated her as a child, and even now she followed NASA's developments with keen interest. Her bedroom walls featured maps of the moon's surface and posters of galaxies. "There's so much more than Ashland," she once told her friend Diane Lewis. "So much more than Georgia, than Earth even. Don't you want to see what's out there?" On her right wrist she wore a silver bracelet with a single charm, a book, a gift from her father before his deployment to Vietnam. "To remind you that stories are everywhere," he had written in his last letter home, "even the ones we haven't lived yet." Captain James Wilcox died near Khe Sanh in 1971. His body returned to Ashland in a flag-draped coffin that seemed impossibly small for a man who had loomed so large in Eliza's childhood. After her father's death, Eliza became more determined, more focused. She worked part-time jobs through high school, saving every dollar. She volunteered at the library, surrounding herself with books about places she'd never been. Paris, Egypt, India. She kept a notebook where she listed facts about these distant locations, as if preparing for a journey she knew would come. "Stubborn as a mule," her mother would say with a mixture of exasperation and pride. When Eliza set her mind to something, neither reason nor emotion could deter her. She had turned down 3 marriage proposals already, much to the consternation of her grandmother, who feared Eliza would miss her chance and end up alone. But Eliza had smiled and shaken her head, immune to the social pressures that governed many young women's choices in Ashland. She had plans, bigger than Ashland could contain. She had applied to the University of Georgia for the fall semester, hoping to complete her bachelor's degree in business administration. She dreamed of eventually moving to Atlanta, perhaps working for one of the big corporations headquartered there. Her acceptance letter arrived on June 12, 1978, and she had framed it, hanging it above her desk where she could see it first thing every morning. The sight of it gave her a flutter of excitement each day, proof that the door to her future was opening. What no one in Ashland knew, what Eliza had confided only in her journal, was her ultimate goal, to work for NASA, perhaps in their administrative offices, not as an astronaut or engineer, but as part of the vast support network that made exploration possible. "Someone has to keep the books balanced, even in space," she had written. It was a dream she kept close, afraid that voicing it might somehow jinx its possibility. Margaret Wilcox was a widow who taught 3rd grade at Ashland Elementary. She raised Eliza alone after her husband's death, in the same white clapboard house where she herself had grown up. She tended a garden of tomatoes and peppers in the backyard and sang in the First Baptist Church choir every Sunday. Her daughter was her world, her pride, her hope, her future. "Mama, I'm going to the library," Eliza called out on that July evening, slipping her notebook into her canvas tote bag. "Don't wait up. I want to finish research for my application essay." Margaret looked up from her grading at the kitchen table. "Take your sweater, it might cool down later." Eliza rolled her eyes but grabbed the light cardigan hanging by the door. "It's 80 degrees out, Mama." "Humor me," Margaret smiled, watching as her daughter tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so familiar it made her heart ache with love. "I'll be home by 10, Eliza promised, the screen door closing behind her with a familiar creak. The clock on the mantel struck 7. Outside, the cicadas had begun their evening chorus, and the sky was turning a deep gold as the sun began its descent. Margaret returned to her grading, unaware that this ordinary moment would be the dividing line of her life, everything before and everything after. By midnight, Margaret had called the sheriff's office. By dawn, half the town was searching the 5 blocks between the Wilcox home and the Sinclair Library. They found Eliza's canvas tote bag in Johnson Park, halfway between the library and home. Her notebook was still inside, along with her house key on a keychain shaped like a ladybug. Her sweater was missing. Sheriff Thomas Hayes organized search parties that combed every inch of Ashland and the surrounding woods. Volunteers from neighboring counties arrived in pickup trucks, ready to help. Eliza's photograph appeared in the Ashland Chronicle, and then in papers across Georgia. Her face looked out from posters taped to storefront windows and telephone poles. The library's night janitor, Roy Simmons, was the last person to report seeing Eliza alive. She had left at 9:40 p.m., waving goodbye as she descended the library steps. The 5-block walk home should have taken her no more than 12 minutes. Days turned into weeks. The summer heat bore down on the searchers, their faces grim and sunburned. The FBI sent an agent from Atlanta, a serious young man named Cooper, who set up a temporary office in the courthouse. Divers searched the lake on the edge of town. Dogs tracked scents that led nowhere. Psychics called with visions that produced nothing. Margaret sat by the phone answering the same questions over and over. Had Eliza mentioned any new friends? Any strange encounters? Any unusual phone calls? Was she dating anyone? Was she unhappy? Did she have secrets? "She was going to the University of Georgia in the fall," Margaret would reply, her voice growing hollower with each repetition. She was happy. She was planning her future. As August arrived, the search parties grew smaller. The FBI agent returned to Atlanta, leaving a file and a promise to keep the case open. The posters began to weather and fade, their corners curling in the humid air, Eliza's smile becoming ghostly behind sun-bleached paper. Life in Ashland resumed its rhythm, though quieter now, as if the town itself were holding its breath. The Sweet Magnolia Diner, which had served as a command center during those first frantic weeks, returned to its normal business. The maps and lists of volunteers were taken down, replaced once again by framed photographs of local sports teams and newspaper clippings about the diner's famous cobbler. Conversations still hushed when Margaret walked in, but the explosive urgency of July had settled into a dull, persistent ache that the town carried collectively. Children returned to school in September. The football season began, with Friday night lights illuminating the field where search parties had gathered just weeks before. Halloween decorations appeared in storefront windows. Thanksgiving came and went. Margaret sitting alone at her dining table with an untouched turkey breast that neighbors had insisted on bringing over. Christmas lights twinkled along Main Street. Carolers avoided the Wilcox house, and another year prepared to slip into history without answers. Only one man seemed tireless in his efforts to find Eliza, Charles Whitman, owner of Whitman Industries, the textile mill that employed nearly a third of Ashland's workforce. At 52, Whitman was Ashland's most prominent citizen, a widower who had transformed his father's struggling business into a regional success. His wife, Eleanor, had died of cancer 5 years earlier, leaving him alone in the sprawling colonial house on the hill overlooking the town. Their only son, Robert, had moved to California after college, making rare appearances at holidays. Whitman stood 6 feet tall with the ramrod straight posture of someone accustomed to command. His hair had gone silver early, giving him a distinguished appearance that, combined with his tailored suits and quiet authority, made him seem almost aristocratic in the casual surroundings of Ashland. He drove a midnight blue Lincoln Continental that he replaced every 2 years, always the same model, always the same color. "We won't rest until we bring her home," he promised Margaret, his hand firm on her shoulder, his cologne subtle but expensive, a scent out of place in her modest kitchen. Whitman organized additional searches, hired private investigators, and offered a reward of $50,000 for information leading to Eliza's whereabouts, an astronomical sum in Ashland, where the average annual income hovered around $12,000. He checked on Margaret regularly, bringing casseroles from his housekeeper and making sure her lawn was mowed. He used his connections to keep Eliza's case in the regional newspapers, arranged for her photograph to appear on billboards across 3 counties, and personally lobbied the governor's office to allocate additional state resources to the investigation. "Mr. Whitman has been a godsend," Margaret told her sister during a rare long-distance call. "I don't know how I'd manage without him." In truth, Margaret wasn't sure how she felt about Whitman's attention. His concern seemed genuine, his resources invaluable. But something about his presence in her home made her uneasy, a feeling she immediately chastised herself for. How could she question the motives of the one person who refused to let Eliza's case grow cold? Who was she to look this gift horse in the mouth when so many others had already moved on? "The Lord tests the righteous," Pastor Miller said during a prayer service for Eliza at First Baptist Church, the pews filled with familiar faces wearing expressions of practiced sympathy. "But Margaret, know that you do not walk this valley alone." The town rallied around her in ways both practical and symbolic. Former students brought handmade cards. Neighbors took turns sitting with her so she wouldn't be alone. The bank kept Eliza's position open, her nameplate still on her teller window. The high school yearbook included a full-page dedication to Eliza, though she had graduated 4 years earlier. Margaret found both comfort and pain in these gestures, grateful for the support, but agonizingly aware that they were the kinds of things done for the dead, not the missing. But as autumn arrived, bringing cooler air and falling leaves, even Margaret could feel the case growing cold. The phone rang less frequently. The sheriff's visits became monthly check-ins rather than daily updates. The missing posters, once refreshed weekly, now hung tattered and faded. Eliza's face bleaching away in the sun and rain. Her bedroom remained untouched, her acceptance letter still framed on the wall, her clothes still hanging in the closet, her owl jar still on the dresser, a thin layer of dust beginning to settle over everything like a shroud. Margaret returned to teaching in September, unable to bear the emptiness of the house during daylight hours. Her third-grade students tiptoed around her at first, whispering when they thought she couldn't hear. "That's the lady whose daughter disappeared," they told each other during recess. But children's attention spans are mercifully short, and soon they treated her normally again, raising their hands with innocent questions about multiplication and spelling, bringing her dandelion bouquets and crayon drawings. Teaching became Margaret's lifeline. For 6 hours each day, she could focus entirely on young minds that needed her, on lessons that had clear objectives and measurable outcomes. The classroom was the one place where she didn't feel people's pity following her like a shadow, where the absence of Eliza wasn't the defining fact of her existence. But the evenings were harder. The empty house echoed with memories. Margaret would catch herself calling out Eliza when she heard a floorboard creak, or setting 2 places at the dinner table out of habit. She kept the porch light on every night, a beacon should Eliza somehow find her way home in the darkness. She slept with her bedroom door open, ears attuned to sounds that never came. By Christmas, people had stopped asking for updates. They greeted Margaret with sad smiles and gentle pats on the arm. The unspoken understanding settled over Ashland like the winter frost. Eliza was gone, and she wasn't coming back. The question of what had happened to her became just another of Ashland's unsolved mysteries, like the fire that destroyed the old mill in '39 or the disappearance of the Baptist minister's wife in '52. Life continued. The Ashland Chronicle reported on new businesses opening and old ones closing, high school sports victories and defeats, marriages, births, deaths. Children were born, grew up and left for college or jobs elsewhere. The courthouse received a new coat of paint. The Crown Theatre closed, replaced by a video rental store. Sheriff Hayes retired, and his son was elected to take his place. The Whitman textile mill was modernized, then partially automated, reducing its workforce by half. Charles Whitman remained a fixture in Ashland, his power and influence growing as the years passed. He expanded his business into real estate development, buying struggling farms at the edge of town and transforming them into subdivisions with names like Magnolia Heights and Willow Creek Estates. He served 3 terms as mayor in the 1980s, overseeing the construction of a new hospital wing named for his late wife and the renovation of the town square. He never remarried, though rumors occasionally linked him to various widows or divorced women passing through town. Married to Ashland, people would say with admiration, no room for another woman in his life. His philanthropy became legendary. Scholarships, library donations, holiday funds for needy families. When the textile industry began to decline nationwide, Whitman diversified his holdings, ensuring that Ashland remained economically stable while similar towns withered. Each year, on the anniversary of Eliza's disappearance, he would visit Margaret, bringing a bouquet of white roses and a quiet reassurance that he hadn't forgotten. "I've hired a new investigator," he might say, or "I've spoken to a former FBI profiler who's interested in the case." Margaret came to depend on these visits to find comfort in Whitman's unwavering belief that someday they would find answers. Margaret continued teaching 3rd grade, watching other people's children grow up while her own remained forever 22. She kept Eliza's room exactly as she had left it, dusting the shelves weekly and changing the sheets every month. On Eliza's birthday each year, she baked a chocolate cake, Eliza's favorite, and left a slice on the windowsill overnight. In the morning she would find it untouched, the frosting hardened, sometimes damp with dew, and she would discard it without comment. "You can't live in the past, Margaret," her sister said during a visit in 1985, watching her perform these rituals with a mixture of pity and exasperation. "Eliza wouldn't want this for you." But the past was where Eliza existed, and Margaret could not bear to let it go. To move forward would feel like abandonment, a second loss more painful than the first, because it would be her choice rather than fate's cruelty. Charles Whitman remained a constant presence in Margaret's life. He checked on her regularly, bringing flowers on Eliza's birthday and making sure her car was serviced. He invited her to social functions at the textile mill, introduced her to visiting dignitaries, and always made a point of publicly acknowledging her strength and dignity. "Margaret Wilcox is the heart of Ashland," he would say during community events. "Her grace in the face of unimaginable loss is an inspiration to us all." On the 10th anniversary of Eliza's disappearance, he established a memorial scholarship at Ashland High School, given annually to a female student who demonstrated the academic promise and determination that had characterized Eliza. The first recipient was Diane Lewis's daughter, a poetic coincidence that brought tears to Margaret's eyes during the ceremony. When he sold Whitman Industries to a larger corporation in 1989, he used part of his fortune to establish a more substantial scholarship in Eliza's name at the University of Georgia, a full 4-year ride for an Ashland student with financial need and academic merit. "She would have done remarkable things," he told Margaret during the scholarship announcement ceremony, his voice catching slightly. "This way, her spirit lives on through others." Margaret found his devotion both comforting and puzzling. "Why does her disappearance matter so much to you?" she once asked him directly, during a rare moment of candor. "You barely knew Eliza." Whitman had looked away briefly, his fingers tracing the edge of his coffee cup. "I've seen what happens when a town forgets its tragedies, Margaret, when painful questions are left unanswered. It poisons everything, slowly but surely." He'd met her eyes then, his own surprisingly vulnerable. "And perhaps I see in you the same quiet dignity my Eleanor showed during her illness, the same refusal to surrender to fate." The answer satisfied Margaret, or at least silenced her doubts. Charles Whitman was simply a good man, carrying his own griefs, using his resources to ease the burdens of others. What other explanation could there be? The years passed. Margaret's hair turned grey, then white. Crow's feet appeared around her eyes, deepened into permanent etchings. Her hands, once smooth and quick across the blackboard, became veined and spotted. the knuckles swelling slightly with the beginnings of arthritis. She retired from teaching in 1999 after 40 years in the classroom. Her former students, now adults with children of their own, organized a retirement party at the elementary school gymnasium. They presented her with a memory book filled with photographs and letters, chronicling 4 decades of third-grade classrooms. The world changed around her. Computers, cell phones, the internet. But inside her house on Maple Street, time stood still. Eliza's acceptance letter yellowed behind its frame. The blue owl jar collected dust. The silver charm bracelet remained in the jewelry box where Eliza had last placed it. The book charm tarnished but still legible. Margaret adapted to retirement by volunteering at the Sinclair Library, shelving books and reading to children during Saturday morning story hours. The librarian, Anne Patterson, had been a freshman when Eliza disappeared, and she treated Margaret with a gentle deference that never acknowledged the reason why. Margaret appreciated this small mercy, the ability to exist in a space where she wasn't primarily defined as the mother of the missing girl. In 2006, Sheriff Daniel Hayes, so like his father in appearance but softer in demeanor, invited Margaret to the department's new cold case unit. They had received a federal grant to digitize old files and apply new forensic techniques to unsolved crimes. Eliza's case was one of the first they planned to revisit. DNA technology has come a long way, Mrs. Wilcox, he explained, showing her the small modern office with its computers and scanner. And the FBI's database systems allow us to make connections that weren't possible back in '78. Margaret nodded, touched by the effort, but wary of hope. Hope had become dangerous over the years, a wild animal that could either warm you or maul you depending on its mood. She had learned to live without it, finding comfort instead in routine, in memory, in the small certainties of daily life. The cold case review yielded nothing. The evidence had been poorly preserved by today's standards, fingerprints not properly lifted, potential DNA samples degraded by improper storage, witness statements filed without follow-up questions that modern protocol would demand. Hayes called Margaret personally to deliver the disappointing news, his voice heavy with regret. "We'll keep trying," he promised. "This isn't the end," but it felt like an end, or at least the closing of another door. Margaret was 72 now, her own health beginning to falter. She had lived without Eliza for nearly as long as she had lived with her. The possibility that she might die without answers had shifted from a fear to a likelihood to an almost certainty. In 2014, the Sinclair Library underwent renovation. During the excavation for an addition, workers discovered a woman's shoe buried near the foundation. A brown loafer, size 7, the leather cracked and discolored, but still recognizable as the Bass Weejuns that had been popular in the late 1970s. Margaret identified it as Eliza's, remembering how her daughter had saved for weeks to buy the expensive shoes, how proudly she had worn them to work at the bank. For a brief moment, the case flickered back to life. Ground-penetrating radar scanned the library grounds. Cadaver dogs were brought in from Atlanta. Television crews arrived from Savannah and Atlanta, setting up satellite trucks in the library parking lot. Margaret found herself in front of cameras again, older now, more reserved, but still asking the same questions that had haunted her for 36 years. Nothing more was found. The shoe's discovery was deemed inconclusive. It could have been buried during the original construction, or discarded years later, or moved by animals or water, or any number of natural forces. The cameras packed up. The dogs went home. The addition to the library was completed, a plaque dedicating the new wing to Eliza's memory the only tangible result. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilcox," Sheriff Daniel Hayes said, standing on her porch in the fading light, his father's features now etched with his own lines of age and responsibility. "We'll keep looking." But everyone knew it was just words, kind, well-meaning words that changed nothing. Margaret thanked him anyway, offered him a glass of sweet tea, asked about his children. The rituals of Southern politeness provided a script when raw emotion would have been too much to bear. Charles Whitman, now in his late 80s, called from his retirement community in Savannah. His voice had grown thinner with age but lost none of its authority. "Don't lose hope, Margaret," he told her. "Not after all these years." Sinclair Library underwent renovation. During the excavation for an addition, workers discovered a woman's shoe buried near the foundation. A brown loafer, size 7. Margaret identified it as Eliza's, and for a brief moment, the case flickered back to life. Ground-penetrating radar scanned the library grounds. Nothing more was found. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilcox," Sheriff Daniel Hayes said, the son looking so much like his father that it sometimes gave Margaret a strange sense of déjà vu. "We'll keep looking." But everyone knew it was just words. Kind, well-meaning words that changed nothing. Until the phone call at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in April 2021. The Whitman property had been vacant for years. After Charles Whitman moved to a retirement community in Savannah in 2015, the large colonial house and its surrounding 5 acres had remained unsold, a relic of Ashland's more prosperous days. Sitting atop the town's highest hill, the house had once been a showplace, white columns gleaming in the sun, manicured grounds visible from Main Street, holiday parties that were the highlight of Ashland's social calendar. But as Whitman aged, the property began to show signs of neglect. The white paint yellowed and peeled. The gardens grew wild, azaleas and camellias fighting for space with encroaching kudzu. The greenhouse, once filled with Eleanor Whitman's prized orchids, stood empty, its glass panes clouded with grime or shattered by summer storms. After Whitman's departure, the house took on a spectral quality, windows like vacant eyes, chimneys listing slightly, the grand front door chained and padlocked against trespassers. Local teenagers occasionally dared each other to climb the hill at night, to peer through windows, or leave their initials carved in the aging magnolia trees. Ghost stories circulated through Ashland High School, tales of Eleanor Whitman's spirit wandering the grounds, of strange lights seen in the upper windows, of voices heard in the empty rooms. Parents discouraged these excursions, citing the dangers of the deteriorating structure, but the forbidden nature of the place only enhanced its allure. When a developer finally purchased the land in early 2021, plans were made to demolish the house and build a small subdivision of 12 homes with a community pool and tennis courts. Whitman Estates, the promotional materials called it, using the Whitman name as a selling point rather than something to be forgotten. The developer, a company from Atlanta with no connection to Ashland's history, saw only prime real estate with excellent views, not a location layered with complicated memories. During the initial excavation, as bulldozers cleared the area behind the old greenhouse, the operator noticed something unusual in the freshly turned soil, a glint of metal catching the morning light. He stopped his machine and climbed down to investigate. What he found was a silver bracelet with a single charm shaped like a book. Lester Jenkins had lived in Ashland all his 63 years. He remembered Eliza's disappearance, remembered the search parties and posters, remembered how the town had changed afterward. Doors suddenly locked, children no longer allowed to walk alone, a wariness that had never quite dissipated. He stared at the bracelet in his weathered palm, understanding immediately what it might mean. With trembling fingers, he reached for the radio in his bulldozer's cab. Sheriff Daniel Hayes arrived within 20 minutes of the call. By afternoon, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation had cordoned off the area. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the spring breeze, a jarring splash of color against the browns and greens of the excavated earth. Word spread through Ashland, with the speed that only small-town tragedy can generate. Whispers in the grocery store aisles, hushed phone calls between neighbors, shocked conversations at the Sweet Magnolia Diner. 2 days later, forensic anthropologists confirmed what everyone already knew. They had found Eliza Wilcox. Margaret, sitting stiffly in a chair at the sheriff's office, nodded when they told her, as if she had been expecting this news for 43 years, which in some ways she had. The remains were buried 6 feet deep, wrapped in what was once a blue blanket, now degraded to fragments that clung to bone. Along with the bracelet, they recovered a cardigan sweater, decomposed but still recognizable by its pearl buttons. Buttons Margaret had sewn on herself after Eliza complained that the original ones were too plain. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the skull, a single powerful blow that would have rendered Eliza unconscious immediately, perhaps mercifully. But it was what they found beneath the remains that truly shocked Ashland. A time capsule, carefully sealed in a metal box. Inside were newspaper clippings about Eliza's disappearance, her driver's license, and a leather-bound journal. The pages were still legible, preserved by the airtight container, the handwriting elegant and precise, unmistakable to anyone in Ashland who had seen it on town ordinances, donation checks, or the plaques that adorned half the public buildings in the county. The journal belonged to Charles Whitman, Margaret sat in Sheriff Hayes' office, her hands steady as she listened to the unimaginable truth. The office was small but neat, with certificates framed on the walls and a desk that had once belonged to Hayes' father. Through the window she could see Main Street, barely changed in 43 years, the hardware store, the diner, the courthouse. The normalcy of the view seemed obscene against the horror of what she was hearing. "The evidence is conclusive, Mrs. Wilcox," Hayes said gently, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and professional determination. He was 52 now, the same age Charles Whitman had been when Eliza disappeared. "The journal, it contains details only the killer would know, and DNA evidence from the sweater matches Mr. Whitman." Margaret's mind struggled to process the information, to reconcile the Charles Whitman she had known. The town benefactor, the scholarship founder, her friend and support for decades, with the monster Hayes described. It was as if two realities were colliding, neither able to fully displace the other. "May I see it?" she asked, her voice surprisingly strong. "The journal." Hayes hesitated, then nodded. "We have photocopies. The original is with the GBI for analysis." He slid a folder across the desk, his movements careful as if handling something volatile. Margaret opened the folder slowly. Inside were pages of neat, flowing script, the handwriting achingly familiar from countless sympathy cards and notes over the years. She began to read. The journal told the story that Ashland had never suspected. Charles Whitman had been obsessed with Eliza since she turned down the Whitman Scholarship the previous spring. The scholarship had been his pet project, his way of identifying promising young people in Ashland and guiding their futures. No one had ever declined it, until Eliza, who had politely explained that she had her own savings and plans for the University of Georgia. "She looks me directly in the eye when she speaks," one early entry read. "Most young women in this town can barely maintain eye contact with me. They understand who I am, what I represent. Not Eliza. She speaks to me as if we are equals. It's both infuriating and intoxicating." Whitman had interpreted her polite rejection as a personal affront, a challenge to his authority and position. He began watching her, noting her schedule at the bank, her visits to the library, her daily routines. The entries became increasingly possessive, describing Eliza as if she were a prize to be claimed or a problem to be solved. "She wears her hair down today. It catches the light when she moves. She should belong to someone who appreciates such beauty, someone who understands its value." On the night of July 17, 1978, he had seen her leaving the library alone. He had offered her a ride as she walked home, pulling alongside her in his Lincoln Continental. The journal described her initial hesitation, then her polite acceptance when a few raindrops began to fall. "I tell her about the scholarship again," the entry for that night read. "I explain that she's making a mistake, that I can offer her advantages beyond what she can imagine." She smiles, that smile that never reaches her eyes when she looks at me, and says, "Mr. Whitman, I appreciate your concern, but I've made my decision," as if her decision matters more than mine. In the car he had tried to touch her, to convince her physically when words failed. When she pushed him away and reached for the door handle, his rage overtook him. He struck her with a paperweight from his glove compartment, an award from the Chamber of Commerce for Business Leader of the Year. The journal described the sound it made, the way her body slumped, the immediate shift from anger to panic. Blood in her hair. So much of it. But no one on the street. No witnesses. I drive to the house, carry her to the greenhouse. I'll decide what to do tomorrow. But by morning, Eliza was dead. The journal detailed how he buried her on his property, how he organized searches that carefully avoided the actual burial site, how he cultivated a friendship with Margaret to stay close to the investigation, and how, over the years, his initial panic transformed into a twisted pride that he had outsmarted everyone. "They looked to me for leadership in the search," he wrote a week after the disappearance. "The irony would be amusing if the stakes weren't so high. Sheriff Hayes asked my permission to bring dogs onto the property today. I suggested they focus on the lake instead. Everyone trusts my judgment implicitly." More disturbing were the entries about Margaret, how he had insinuated himself into her life, monitoring her interactions with police, shaping the investigation through his influence, all while playing the role of concerned citizen and friend. "Margaret showed me Eliza's acceptance letter today. She keeps it framed, poor woman. She has no idea that her confidant is the very person who ensured her daughter never made it to the university. There's a peculiar intimacy in being trusted by the mother of the girl you killed. An almost godlike power. The final pages of the journal, dated just before his move to Savannah, revealed a man neither remorseful nor fully sane, a man who had come to see Eliza's murder, not as a crime, but as a necessary correction, a realignment of the natural order in which his will was paramount. She belongs to me now in a way she never would have in life. Her name attached to my scholarship, her memory preserved through my generosity. I've shaped how she's remembered, controlled the narrative. In the end, she couldn't escape my influence after all. Margaret closed the folder, her hands now trembling slightly. Outside, a car horn honked. Someone called a greeting to a friend, the ordinary sounds of Ashland continuing as if the world hadn't just shattered. "We've sent officers to Savannah," Sheriff Hayes continued, relief evident in his voice that she had finished reading. "They're bringing him in now." Margaret nodded, her face expressionless. "All these years," she whispered, "all these years, he sat across from me at my kitchen table. He brought me flowers on her birthday. He held my hand at the memorial service." The arrest of Charles Whitman, now 95 and suffering from early-stage dementia, sent shockwaves through Ashland. People gathered on Main Street, their faces stunned as the news spread. The man who had shaped their town, who had employed their parents and grandparents, who had funded their libraries and scholarships, was a murderer. "I knew something wasn't right about him," people began to say, rewriting their memories to accommodate this new reality. Always too perfect, too helpful. But Margaret knew the truth. No one had suspected. Ashland had embraced Charles Whitman as its patron saint, its success story. He had hidden in plain sight, attending the prayer vigils for Eliza, standing beside Margaret as she pleaded for information about her daughter. The trial was brief. Despite his age and mental condition, Whitman was found competent to stand trial. Faced with overwhelming evidence, his attorneys negotiated a plea deal, guilty of second-degree murder, in exchange for a sentence that would allow him to serve his time in a secured medical facility rather than prison. On the day of his sentencing, Margaret sat in the courtroom, her back straight, her eyes never leaving the stooped figure in the wheelchair. The same courtroom where, decades earlier, Whitman had announced the scholarship in Eliza's name. When asked if she wanted to make a victim impact statement, Margaret approached the podium. The courtroom fell silent. "For 43 years," she began, her voice clear and unwavering, "I have lived with an open wound. I have woken every morning with the same first thought, where is my daughter? Now I know she has been 5 miles from my house, buried on the property of the man who pretended to help me find her." She paused, looking directly at Whitman. His eyes, clouded with age and perhaps with something else, met hers briefly before shifting away. "I will not speak of forgiveness today. Some acts lie beyond its reach. But I will speak of Eliza, not as a victim, but as the bright, determined young woman she was. She would have turned 65 this year. She might have had children, grandchildren, a career, a lifetime of ordinary Tuesdays and special occasions. Charles Whitman stole all of that, from her and from me." Margaret returned to her seat. The judge pronounced the sentence, 30 years to life in a secured medical facility. At 95, everyone knew it amounted to a death sentence. As the deputies wheeled Whitman toward the side door, he suddenly turned, his voice quavering but audible in the hushed courtroom. "She shouldn't have said no," he said, his expression momentarily lucid. "No one said no to me." The words hung in the air, a final confession more damning than the journal entries or the DNA evidence. The entitlement of a powerful man, preserved like a fossil across decades. 3 weeks later, Eliza Wilcox was properly laid to rest in the Ashland Cemetery. The entire town attended the service, former classmates now in their 60s, retired bank colleagues, former students of Margaret's who had children of their own. They stood beneath oak trees as Pastor Miller's son, now the minister of First Baptist Church, spoke words of comfort that had been 43 years in coming. Margaret placed the blue ceramic owl jar on the casket before it was lowered into the ground. Inside were the acceptance letter from the University of Georgia, carefully removed from its frame, and a single pearl button from the recovered cardigan. That evening, as twilight settled over Ashland, Margaret sat on her porch swing, the same swing where she had waited for Eliza to come home that July night in 1978. The air was sweet, with the scent of magnolias, and in the distance she could hear the high school band practicing for the spring concert. She held Eliza's silver bracelet in her palm, restored to her by the GBI after they completed their investigation. The book charm caught the last light of day, gleaming softly. The phone rang inside the house. For the first time in 43 years, Margaret didn't rush to answer it. Whatever news it brought could wait. Tonight she would sit with the knowledge that Eliza had been found, that the truth had finally emerged from the Georgia clay, that justice, imperfect and decades late, had finally arrived. The cicadas began their evening chorus, just as they had on that July evening long ago. Margaret closed her eyes and listened. The sound had not changed in all these years. Some things remained constant, even as the world transformed around them. Across town, the Ashland Chronicle was preparing the next day's front page. The headline would read, "Whitman dies in custody, takes final secrets to grave." But that was tomorrow's news, tomorrow's grief. Tonight, Margaret rocked gently in the porch swing, holding her daughter's bracelet, allowing herself to remember Eliza not as a mystery or a tragedy, but as she truly was, a young woman with chestnut hair that caught the sunlight and plans that reached beyond the horizon of their small town. Time may bury the truth, but in Ashland, Georgia, the earth eventually gives up its secrets. What was hidden beneath magnolia trees and respectability has finally come to light. Some justice arrives too late for comfort, but perhaps never too late for peace. If you've been moved by Eliza's story, remember that across America, thousands of families still wait for answers. Their cases grow cold, but their hope never dies. Support the work of those who refuse to let these stories be forgotten, so that every hidden truth may finally find the light of day.